Welcome to the Career Metis podcast. I'm your host Nisar Ahmed. I'm the founder and editor of the blog careermetis.com. And this is episode 33 of the Career Metis podcast. And this episode is part of the Career Expert Series episode. I'm interviewing Caroline Ceniza-Levine. She's a co-founder of Six Figure Start. Caroline has appeared in numerous media outlets, all the major ones, Fox, CNBC, CBS, for multiple interviews and also multiple career books. Caroline, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Well, first of all, what I would love to hear is, I know in the introduction I've quickly skimmed over a lot of the important details, but I wanted everyone to get a context of who you are. Maybe you can help us out. Start off by quickly yourself and also a little bit about your business, Six Figure Start.
Sure. So Six Figure Start was founded in 2008, and we are a career coaching firm that works with job seekers, career changers, and those who are gainfully employed but looking to get to that next level. All of our coaches are former recruiters. So we really pride ourselves on bringing the employer's perspective, what an employer is thinking about when they hire and when they decide who to promote, who to let go. We bring that sensibility and that insider knowledge to our clients.
I'm very curious about Six Figure Start. Of course, it is very catchy. It gets your attention. Can you tell us a little bit more about why you came up with that name?
Yeah, so the name actually connotes two things. So first of all, my co-founder, Connie Thanasoulis Saraccio, she ran campus recruiting for Citigroup, Warner Lambert, and Merrill Lynch. And I ran campus recruiting for Time Inc. I also am a former management consultant in investment banking and recruited for both of those industries. So between the two of us, we really worked with we hired thousands of students as interns as well as recent graduates into their first jobs for professional services, for knowledge worker type of jobs in the most competitive industries, investment banking, strategy consulting, media. And so Six Figure Start really refers to getting that six-figure start, getting that first job that propels you into a six-figure career. But we also work with the mid-career and the experienced executive professional. And these folks are well into the six figures, multiple six figures, sometimes seven figures. For those folks, reaching that echelon of the six-figure career is really the start of their journey. They still need to think about, are they happy? Are they growing? Are they fulfilled by the career that they've built? And so I work very closely with executives who are looking at taking their life to the next level. So it might be something around work-life balance. It might be taking their business or their line of business to new heights. It might be entering a different career altogether. So I recently worked with the managing editor of a very famous consumer magazine who semi-retired, if you will. He took time off and he stepped down from his role building that magazine to very successful heights, and then thought he was going to retire, did that for about 18 months, and then said, this isn't for me. I want to do something. And he ended up getting an executive position in a new media firm. So doing something related to, but very different than what he did before. And it's much more entrepreneurial, and it really fits where he is in his life right now. And so I'm really excited about getting to do that. So it's a start for him, even though, of course, he's well into the six figures of his career.
Based on your introduction, you mentioned you target two different markets. One is the established professional who wants to take the career to the next level. On the other hand, you have the young professional or the new graduate who's trying to get a start. So I wanted to spend some time on the new and young professional. When they come to you, what are some of the challenges that they specifically reach out to you for?
So obviously one of the biggest challenges being at the beginning of the career is that sometimes they don't have a clear sense of what they're interested in. Part of it is that they just haven't had a lot of exposure to business in general, or to the economy, or even if they're thinking about nonprofit, to different organizations. So they might have a sense for what their their interests are, but they don't know how to translate that into the job market. And that's really where our company can help, because again, we've been on the employer side. So we've recruited across all these different industries and sectors, so including the nonprofit sector. And so we can help suss out, based on what they enjoy doing, what types of issues they like working on, what types of people and environments they like working in. We can help them think through, okay, these might be some specific industries to look at. These might be some specific functional areas to look at. And that's really the first thing that every job seeker needs to do, is to have a clear idea of what their target market is.
You specifically mentioned interests. So, how important is it for someone to align their interests with their new career or new job they are seeking?
When I talk about interests, I'm practical about this as well. So I'm using interest broadly to say, what someone is naturally curious about in terms of industries that they follow, in terms of roles that they might want to play, but also in terms of the other criteria that they need to have in the work that they do. Some people want to live in a certain geography, and some geographies lend themselves to certain industries or not. If you are, let's take an extreme example. I'm in New York City, and there are a lot of industries that are represented here. But I remember working with a student who was really interested in energy, and specifically oil and gas. And he wanted to stay in New York City. And if he wanted to be on the operational side of things, in the project management side of things, which is really what he wanted, he needed to be in Texas or in some other pockets, but certainly not New York City. Now, if he wanted to be on the financing end of things, if he wanted to look at perhaps alternative energy, some energy technology, there might be enough here in New York City, but sometimes you really have to be realistic about your interests and how they match up with the life and the lifestyle that you're thinking about. I'll have some folks who say that they're interested in finance and they're really interested in the financial markets, but they also want to have flexibility. They want to have work-life balance. That's something that's very meaningful to them. I started my career in investment banking. That's just not a balanced lifestyle. And that's a function of the way that the industry works. So there are ways that you can get involved with finance that aren't necessarily corporate finance or investment banking. And so that's where a new graduate needs to be realistic and practical and really meld all of their interests, their professional and their personal.
What are some of the things that you actually walk them through? Like, what are the first two or three things that you would suggest they look into?
So we actually take them through a 6-step process. And this is actually outlined in a textbook that Connie and I wrote, 6 Steps to Job Search Success, which over 40 universities actually use in their job search curriculum. And so identify your target is that first step that we just talked about. And then the other 5 are related basically to the tactics that will get you to your target markets. And the second one is around marketing. So there are 4 basic tools. There's more here, but there's 4 basic tools you absolutely need to have: your resume, your online profile, your networking pitch, and your cover letter in terms of how you market yourself. You also need to do research, which is step 3, really understanding the industries that you say that you're interested in, companies in those industries, and the functional role that you're looking at. What is it like day to day? What are people's typical backgrounds? How will you need to position yourself? So that all comes from research. And marketing and research are things that really involve just you. You can be doing that in the library. You can be working on your resume in your own home. But then when you get to step 4, this is when you're really putting yourself into the market, and that's networking and interviewing. So we put that actually as one step, even though technically these are 2 different things. When you're having coffee with someone and it's an informational discussion, it's not a job interview. That's obviously a very different protocol than than a job interview, whether it's over the phone or in someone's office. However, these are actually both relationship building exercises. And we really try to get our clients, whether they're entry level or experienced, to think about networking and interviewing as one category, as that relationship building with other people who are going to either hire you or help you to be hired. So that's all one step. And then step 5 is to stay motivated, organized, and troubleshoot your search. So this, again, this is external facing in the sense that this is the moment where you're talking to people. You might be tweaking your resume based on what you've heard. You might be looking into other companies or into other roles altogether based on what you're learning. And so you really need systems and a process for staying on top of your search and staying on top of your emotions and your motivation with all the ups and downs of a job search, as you can imagine. Yes, I got the interview. Oh, I didn't get called back. Yes, I got called back. Oh, I didn't get the offer, right? So there are a lot of ups and downs of the search. You really need to work on that. And we break that out as a separate step because you need to be deliberate and proactive about what you're doing there. And then finally, step 6 is negotiate and close the offer. And so obviously the job search ends with the offer. We always say it ends with the offer and not with the job, because I always want to remind people you want to get as many offers as possible. So you're always trying to move a company that you're talking to the offer stage. And you may say yes or you may say no. You're only going to accept one job. But you do want to get multiple offers. It gives you options, it gives you leverage. And so we like to train our clients and work with our clients to think about the job search as moving towards the offer and not so much focused on, what's that one perfect job that I'm going to accept. You want to get multiple offers.
Step number 6, what you just mentioned, is a little bit different than what most people are used to, right? Because someone who's newly graduated is looking to get a job. So here you're trying to shift the mindset, saying it's not about getting the job, it's about getting multiple offers. Interesting change in mindset. So what I want to do, I wanted to dig deep into a few of the points that you mentioned. One thing that really stood out for me is motivation. And I've been there, and even the career coaches I've spoken to have mentioned that job search is mentally, it is sometimes just nerve-wracking. How does one stay motivated when they are going through this process?
So I would say that I break down motivation in terms of short-term and long-term motivation. So there's the idea of a short-term motivation is if you think about being in a job interview, you need to be able to motivate yourself immediately in that moment, right? In that immediate term, you have to get motivated whether or not you had a good day, whether or not it's raining outside and you don't like the rain, or it puts you in a bad mood. You have to be able to get yourself in the zone, if you will, of your search. And so I do work with my clients on thinking through that game day strategy, I call it, when you are going to a conference, going to a career fair, going to an interview, going to a networking meeting. What are those game day situations where you need to be able to find your motivation? And then we work on, really coming up with a routine that's helpful and supportive, coming up with triggers that will get them in their zone for that day. And so that's one element of motivation. But then there's the long-term motivation, which is to carry you through the weeks and months of a job search. And really, if you think about career as a marathon and not a sprint, really through the years of planning your career, because it's not just getting that first job, as we know. And so long-term motivation is really about how do you build in various intervals those activities and support systems that are going to re-energize you and refresh you and enable you to get out of a funk quickly if you are feeling perhaps frustrated or anxious, if your morale has perhaps dipped. You need to have those systems in place. And, again, I work with my clients to figure out what works for them, because what works for one person doesn't necessarily work for another. And people are also at a different stage always with their search. There are some folks who are so clear on what they have to do that they really can find a way to self motivate, and we have to spend less time on this. And then there are others where it's a constant struggle. They might have already come into the search with some confidence issues, some anxiety issues, and so every small step of the search is really really hard for them. And so you're going to be somewhere in between that spectrum, and so you really need to find what works for you.
Interesting. Thanks for sharing those tips, because it is important to keep yourself in the right mindset, especially when you're going through that process. So now I want to shift gears into the process that you mentioned. Once someone identifies their market, the next thing you mentioned is marketing, resume, cover letter, and also your own personal brand. The word personal brand is mentioned a lot of times. Almost every day you hear about it. But for someone just starting out who doesn't necessarily have a lot of experience, how do they go about working on that person? Can they create a brand, and how is my question?
Sure. Well, everyone starts with a brand because everybody has already been doing something. So, for a recent graduate, their longest job, if you will, is as a student. So, certainly their academic performance is one indicator. Their extracurricular activities is another indicator. The roles that they played in their community and different clubs and in student government, possibly, or in residential life, those are all indicators, and they're all facets of your brand. So we all have something that's existing, and that's where even something as simple as a resume, which outlines everything that you've done, part-time work, internships, volunteer, things that obviously if you're 20 years in your career and you have professional paid long time work experience, those other factors will diminish in importance. But in the beginning, that's what you have, and that's what you brand.
Something that is attached to branding is LinkedIn. And it helps in two things. It helps in branding and networking as well. What are your thoughts on LinkedIn for someone starting out?
So LinkedIn is, it's very much like a resume in the sense that it is your chronology, essentially. It is your experience. Your education is on there. Your activities are on there. What's great about LinkedIn is that it's a resume that's accessible to everybody. And so I encourage folks who are active in the job search to use LinkedIn, because most people use LinkedIn and will depend on it in terms of their networking. So with recruiters, they definitely use LinkedIn. I will say that they use it less often for recent graduates because there's not much there to be searching on. But because recruiters are there, employers are there, you want to be on there. And networking when you're starting out in your career is a great way to get a foot in the door. And if you get introduced to someone, let's say a friend of yours says, you should talk to Nisser, and I'm going to mention your name to him. Well, when your friend contacts you and says, hey, you should talk to John Doe, what's one of the first things you're going to do? You're going to Google John Doe. And LinkedIn has such great SEO. It's probably one of the first things that's going to come up. And so you're looking at John Doe's LinkedIn profile to decide not whether or not to hire him or refer him, but even just whether or not to talk to him, to take that introduction from your friend. And so you look at that profile, and so you absolutely want to be on there. It is a way to represent your brand and to share it with people. And I always give this tip about your email signature. If you put your LinkedIn URL in your email signature, it's a very elegant and non-intrusive way of sharing your resume essentially with everyone, even your personal contacts, because people might know you from student government or from your community service, but they don't know what you majored in necessarily. They don't know what your part-time jobs or internships are. And if they're thinking about, oh, should I introduce this person? They can very simply click on your LinkedIn profile. It's right there. And then you can share your background with the world, essentially.
What would your suggestions be in terms of the top tips on how one can optimize both their resume and cover letter? Let's say they've identified the target companies. What are some of the best practices that you would recommend?
Obviously, there are keywords that are going to be important to your industry and your function, and you should know what those are. You can look at a job description for a job that you want, and you can see how it's described, and you can see how closely your descriptions match what that job is. If it has the skills listed, so if there are specific software programs or computer languages or analytical skills that are well represented in the jobs that you're looking for, you want to make sure that those same things are well represented in your resume. But I think the most important thing is to make your resume readable. A recruiter spends seconds on a resume. And so resumes with a lot of text, with a lot of long phrases, with very little white space. It's all words, and it's just hard to get even to see past how much text is in there. That's not very friendly to the reader. And so there's a saying that says, a confused mind says no. So if your resume is hard to read and it's confusing, and the companies and the titles and the dates don't easily jump out to the reader, it's not going to be conducive for someone to glean a lot of insight from your resume. And so you might think that you're putting out more information, but what you're actually doing is confusing the reader, putting out more noise, and that's not going to help you either.
One thing I wanted to ask, and this is a controversial subject, and when I say controversial, because I've heard different schools of thought. One school of thought, cover letters are not necessary. The other school of thought saying cover letters are absolutely necessary. Where do you stand on that? Like, what are your thoughts on cover letters?
I did a blog post for my Forbes column, so I write for Forbes Leadership, and it is one of actually my most widely read blog posts, I think, for this question that you ask exactly. And I wrote why you still need a cover letter even though no one reads it. So it's a really interesting piece of the job search. I will attest as a recruiter that a large proportion of the employer decision making population, so recruiters and hiring managers, they don't read cover letters. But the small percentage that do really care about them. And unfortunately for the job seeker, you don't really know who that is, right? You don't know in advance who's going to be reading your stuff and if they really care about the cover letter or not. And so I would say that the most thorough job seeker absolutely has a cover letter. And not only that, but the cover letter is separate from the resume. It's a second marketing piece. And if you had the choice of showing someone one or two marketing pieces and you're trying to make a sale, which in your case is getting hired, well, wouldn't you rather have more touch points than less? So you always want to have one, but I agree with you that not everyone reads one. But you want to put it out there because you don't know who's going to read it, and also because it gives you an opportunity, unlike the resume, to highlight specific things in your background, to speak to the reader in a very different way, and in a prose way, in a storytelling way that the resume just does not do with its chronology of facts and its bullet pointed descriptions. This way you can pick and choose what you're talking about. You can highlight specific patterns in your background that may not jump out at the reader or may require work for the reader to realize. You can put that in your cover letter. And if you know a lot about the company, remember I talked about research being so important, and we break it out as a separate step. That's how important it is. You can show how much you know about the company, how much you care. It's very difficult to do that in a resume. I would say it's next to impossible to show desire in a resume. But a cover letter is all about desire because it's basically saying, this is why you should interview me.
Obviously is going to be the interview, because someone has built up their brand, they've marketed themselves, they've got the resume, they've got the cover letter. The thing that they've been looking for, the interview with the hiring manager, they've been invited. What would be your recommendations when someone is called in for an interview?
Gosh, I could talk about interviews for hours, and I do interview training and it takes hours, right? So what I want to share something that I think that people forget, and that is the way that you interview is about practice, right? So if you haven't done an interview in a while, and I don't consider interviews with other companies to be practice. Okay, that's not practice, that's the actual game. So you want interview practice to be done with a coach, with a mentor, with your career services. You want to have a situation where you can go through the interview, feel what the anxiety is going to feel like, feel what your nerves are going to feel like, have to go through your answers, have to get questions on the fly from a stranger, have to hear them challenge you and push back and probe on some of your answers. You have to know what that feels like. And then you, together with your coach, mentor, career services, or whoever is helping you, you get feedback and you get some ideas about how to handle things, because you don't want your first interview to be with someone that matters. You want it to be with someone who's supportive, who's going to give you actual feedback that you can use. And so it always amazes me that people will go into an interview and they've prepared in their head, but we don't speak the way we think in our head. Maybe they've written things down, but we don't speak the way we write. And they've never told a soul about the things that they're going to try to explain in an interview. And they've also never practiced getting curveball questions or getting probing questions and those pushing those buttons that make you nervous. And it's a real shame when people walk into an interview unprepared, I feel like.
That makes sense. Practice with someone, a friend, family. Get all the questions out before you go in front of someone who has the decision making.
Yeah, and I would say, what I would say about friends and family is you want to practice with someone who has recently hired someone. You want to practice with someone who knows how job interviews work now. I remember working with a young professional, and he talked like he was born in the 1950s. And I said to him, where are you getting this stuff? And he said, well, my parents have been helping me with my interview. And I just thought, oh my goodness, let's not do that. Okay. So you want to be careful who you get advice from as well, because, and I'm not saying that his parents weren't well-meaning people, but today's job search is not the job search from 20 years ago. I have children who are old enough to be looking for their first, internships and jobs, and their job search is not like my job search when I was coming out of school. Now, because I've been working with universities and I've been hiring young professionals and I've been working with a lot of young professionals, I know what job search is like today. So it's not a question of age, it's a question of exposure. So if you have parents or if you have adult friends who have recently hired people, then I would say absolutely go for it. As long as they know your industry and function that you're targeting, and they can work with you objectively and be hard on you and give you candid feedback, then great. But just make sure it's someone who's actually been in the market, in the last 5 years. A lot has changed even in the last 5 years.
The last question I wanted to ask here is obviously about the negotiation, getting close to the offer. Now, this is nerve-wracking for anyone, even someone who has been in the profession for a while. It is not something people are usually used to. So, how should they prepare their mind, and what steps should they take to prepare for a salary negotiation position?
So I blog a lot about negotiation because I do think that it's a big black box for people. Similar to interviews, I would say that practice is the key. And I would say even probably more critically than interviews, because we've probably interviewed more than we have negotiated, even. So at least, a student, for example, has interviewed for their college typically. They've interviewed for an internship or a part-time job, but they probably didn't negotiate with their college, and they didn't negotiate their first part-time jobs. So negotiation is something that really, really doesn't happen that often for folks. And so you want to work with someone, you want to get a sense for, again, what's it like to say what it is that you're asking for the salary that you're looking for to leave your lips. Do you even know what some of the components of a job offer are? Do you know what beyond salary is going to happen with this job? my biggest recommendation for negotiation is to practice it. To practice it with someone who is familiar with offers. Again, people who have hired people, perhaps your career services can help. And the reason why I tell people to practice is because, at least with interviews, you've probably had a few. Even a student will have interviewed for his or her college, will have some part time jobs under the belt that they've interviewed for, but negotiation, they probably didn't negotiate their admission. They probably didn't negotiate their first part time jobs. So, with negotiation, you want to know what that feels like. You want to practice your salary request leaving your lips. You don't want to just think about it. You actually want to practice what that request is going to sound like. You want to understand the other elements of the offer. It's not just about salary. There's benefits, there's your start date, there's time to decide on the offer. There could be issues like being part of the bonus pool. There could be issues around when your next salary is going to be decided. Will it be decided annually? Is there a chance that you might be put up, within 6 months in terms of reconsidered for salary movement? So there can be a lot of other issues within an offer that are not just about salary. So someone needs to understand that as well. And then really understanding what their market is. And this is why, again, we had that step on research, because you really need to know your market and understand what's customary for your market. And if you're entering, let's say, a well-structured program, an investment banking analyst or associate program, a large management consulting firm, a large marketing firm where they're hiring dozens and dozens of students, there's going to be a limit to what you're going to be able to negotiate. And you want to know what those limits and constraints are, because you want to be realistic and show that you're savvy, that you know your role, you know your market. And so when you ask for something, the company will take you seriously.
Perfect. So, Caroline, we have covered ground here. We covered from the beginning to end, all from branding yourself, networking, resume, interviews, and of course the salary negotiation. After listening to this interview, if the audience wanted to get in touch with you to learn more about you or also reach out to you with questions, what are some of the best ways to reach you?
What I would suggest is our website, which is sixfigurestart.com, and six is spelled out SIX. In the tab Work With Us, there is a free resources page there. And under the free resources are a number of different toolkits around networking, negotiation, and branding, because those are the three questions we get a lot. And there's also a job search assessment. It's a self-assessment that you do. So it's a very fun quiz to take. And it actually walks through the 6 steps that I described, asks you a number of questions in those 6 steps. And so in doing the self-assessment, not only will you get a real-time idea of how you're doing, what you've been thinking about and what you've been working on, but you'll also have really a summary of the steps that I talked about and some ideas for each one that you should be working on. And so that can really help you get started and move forward even more than my tips today. It goes into a lot more detail. And those are just the free resources. And then obviously there's coaching with us. And so we have a program which actually has 20 workshops that we have recorded on these topics. And so it goes into a lot more detail. And so that's just the start of it. So there's a lot more there.
Caroline, we are coming to the end of the interview. So before we conclude, are there any last words, anything that you would like to add in addition to what we have discussed so far?
I've worked with so many different types of job seekers, as you mentioned, even in the intro, from the entry level to the established. And they've had all sorts of challenges with their job search, whether it's not knowing what they want to do or something that's more specific and tactical. But what I've always found, is that these issues are solvable. Regardless of where you are in your job search or how frustrated or how stuck it seems like you are, my guess is that there is a solution out there for you. And it might not be the same solution that worked for your friend, and maybe that's what you've tried and that's why it hasn't worked for you. But there is something out there. I've hired so many people, I've seen so many careers that I just know that success is there for most everybody if you're willing to work on it. So, my guess is that if you're stuck in your job search, tomorrow is another day. And if you can get the help and the resources that you need, you can probably turn your search around and get a job that you really, really want.
Caroline, thanks for that. We will conclude the episode, but I wanted to sincerely thank you for sharing your wisdom, sharing your ideas. It was a pleasure having you as a guest on today's episode.
Thanks for having me, Nisser.
And to our listeners, thanks for joining us and listening to this episode of the Career Matters podcast. I have written a brief summary of the interview with some additional links that Caroline has mentioned during our interview. If you liked what you heard, feel free to subscribe to the Career Matters podcast on iTunes. And for more content, ideas, tips, resources, go to careermatters.com. If you enjoyed the episode and also learned something new, feel free to post a comment. And if you really loved the episode, definitely go ahead and share this episode with your social network. Until next time, this is Nisar Ahmed, your host for the Career Matters podcast. Thank you.